In this episode of My Words, My Book, we have Richard O'Neill. Richard O'Neill MBE is an acclaimed storyteller, author, playwright and educator from Northern England. Raised in a nomadic Romani family, he champions inclusion through storytelling, a professor, literacy advocate and award-winning writer. He co-founded Diverse Book Week and Trails of Tales. He leads on creativity for the National Centre for Children's Books. Richard, why did you become an author?
I suppose it was kind of a secondary thing to storytelling because I'd always been a storyteller, and when I was again asked to be a professional storyteller, do it for money, then it was a kind of a continuation. People would be saying, have you got any books? When's your next book coming out? And I didn't have a book. And then it was a case of a publisher contacting me and saying, would you be interested in putting some of your stories into books? And that's how I became an author.
Wow. And I think it's super interesting for the children if you share your background to storytelling and why storytelling is important to you.
Well, in my family, we're Romani people, so I was probably one of the last people to be born nomadically. So I lived in a caravan and travelled around. And, the literacy wasn't a great thing in our family, but storytelling was everything. It was our history, it was how we communicated really well, it was how we told about the past, the present and the future. So for me, I always say being steeped in storytelling at a very early age was a hugely beneficial thing. And then once I discovered books at 4, then I taught myself to read on one of them. And that again opened up that world of books to me, and which I became what I call a bookhead. I always had my head stuck in a book.
And that's an amazing story, I think, leaning into your culture there, because my background is Caribbean St. Lucian heritage, and there was always stories being told, always, in terms of from my mum sharing stories, my grandmother, and hearing those stories. So I feel that when you come from a culture where storytelling is everything that you hear, that you see, that you do, you go to a party, there's always, an uncle sharing their favourite story. And I'm sure you've probably got a favourite story that was passed down to you that may be really interesting to share.
Well, there's lots of them, and a lot of them I put into my books, and a lot of them I have as my staple stories when I go out. But there are so many.
Share one.
Share one. I think this was, I guess, looking at the difference between people and cultures. And I think I always say this. I think if you're a child from a different community, you don't know you're different until someone else points it out. So I was just me living in amongst all these people who told a lot of stories and maybe sounded a bit different, dressed a bit different to other people. And we lived in a caravan, other people lived in houses, that was fine. But when I went to school when I was 5, then there was a real culture difference. It was a real culture shock. And being sort of outside a lot and then going to school and being quite contained, even though I loved learning and I loved all the books in the library, I would stand and I would look out at the fields and just wish I was in the fields rather than in the school playground. And then when I was at that school, I was looking at pit ponies. Now, back up in the northeast where I come from, in the coal mines, they would have these little ponies. And when I was very, very young, tiny, 4 or 5, they were just doing away with them. They were the last ones. And I saw them all in a field. They were having a holiday. And me and my cousins, now we had some very spirited horses and we were used to that because they pulled carts and they raced and all these kinds of things. But we saw these horses essentially in a field. There was so many of them, 50, 60 of them, never seen so many. And we went in to go and have a look at them, and they never moved. They didn't move away from us. We jumped on their back, they didn't move. We went from horse to horse to horse to horse to horse, and then we found out afterwards they were pit ponies. They were just used to walking underground, and they weren't badly looked after, they were well looked after, but their life was one of just moving around these tunnels and pulling these carts. And that was how I came to create the picture book, which is Polonius the Pit Pony. So that's one of my favourite stories, and one of my stories I told my children and grandchildren, and that's the story that
It
came
gets
into a book.
passed down, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it's become a story that now is 3 generations, isn't it?
Exactly. So, Richard, I have seen your storytelling, and it's absolutely, you're very animated. You free flow in terms of how you tell stories, and it's always interesting when, if I'm in a school and a child says to me, Laura, how long have you been an author for? And I would say, I'm not an author, I'm a storyteller. So sometimes I tell stories orally, and then sometimes I write stories down. And I would say that's the same with you, Richard.
It's really interesting that, Laura, because when I'm talking with the older children, teenagers in schools or colleges, or as I did a lecture at a university last week, I talk about stories being the heart of all communication. That's the first thing. And then what we do, and what I've learned, and I know you do lots and lots of different things with your stories, we put them into different formats.
Yes.
So we take a story and we put it into a book, then we're an author. We write a script for an animation or a film, and now we're a screenwriter. I've written my stories for the theatre, so now I'm a playwright. But it's story is the main thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think for every single child has a story within them, even talking about their own family, even talking about the way they get to school in the morning, or if they're homeschooled, what their homeschool environment looks like and feels like for them. So children, everybody is a storyteller. So yourself, Richard, you shared there you had your first book when you was 4, and that was your opening into the world of books. Can you remember what was your favourite book as a child?
My favourite book as a child was the book that I learned to read on, which was a Ladybird book called The Farm. And I think I connected with that one because it was about animals. We had animals. We used to do lots of things around farms, and sometimes we would pay the farmer to stay on a farm with our caravans. And so that really spoke to me. And I think that's one of the things I'm always trying to do with books, with story, is to make sure that children get seen, children connect to something. And you were talking about storytelling before, and for me, I guess it's a conversation with the audience. I'm trying to have a lovely conversation in the same way that we were both brought up where conversation was story. It would be considered rude to talk to somebody and just say, oh, by the way, let me tell you something about me. It's a case of, oh, guess what happened to me last week? And your Uncle Harry, he was there, and this, and it just goes on, and it becomes this lovely tapestry. And I think that's what we're trying to do. Picture books are great for that because they give us those lovely pictures, and they give the child an opportunity to step into that for a while. And that's what I did, I think, with that book. I saw the animals and stepped into it.
So do you think then, Richard, we're losing the art of storytelling now?
That's really interesting because I think it is an art, and I think it's a craft. And I'd often say if you do a craft long enough and well enough, it will become an art. But I think a lot of people think that you can do things very quickly. And people say to me, I want to be a storyteller. I want to be a great storyteller. And I say, well, the first 10 years will probably be the hardest.
Totally.
After that, it'll get a bit easier. But it is a lifelong thing for me. It is an art, it's a craft. The more you do it, the more exciting it becomes. I'm more excited about it now than when I started professionally 20 odd years ago. And because it's so important, and it's very much of the now. And it's really interesting to see so many things about storytelling. You see it in adverts.
Absolutely.
Oh, this is the story of my company. And everybody's trying to, story. There's 2 words I think that are going to be the words of the future. Some people will jump on the bandwagon, but people like us have already been doing it. And the 2 words are story and play.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think what we do as storyteller, we're playing with words.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think play is a big thing, I think, to storytelling. And I wanted to bring in play there because we're both quite old. I'm speaking about myself here. And I wanted to share about the importance of play, especially in your community, Richard, growing up, and what that felt like and looked like, and the connection to children playing and storytelling?
Well, I always say that when I'm working with children in school and we're doing storytelling or we're doing writing, I'm saying, look, we're playing with words here, and words love children, by the way, they absolutely love you. So we're going to muck about with these words. We're going to be playful, and it is about being playful with those words. And I think for me, coming from my community, my dad was brought up in a very, very tough environment. You know, my dad's been dead for a long time now, but my dad was great at, again, telling stories about his childhood, which was like the 1930s, and it was quite tough. You know, they lived in wagons or tents and really bad winters. But he always taught me this thing, and he told me this story about one of the jobs they had in the winter was to go to this yard where all these trains were, and they were bringing wood, logs from out in the countryside to the city, so that, you know, people could sell them and put them on fires. And my dad would get there very early in the morning to get the best logs, standing on back of these maybe snow-covered, you know, railway trucks, climbing up and getting on top. And one of the things he taught me was that no matter how tough it is, what you're doing, the job you're doing, you have to find the fun. Yeah. So him and his brother would be trying to find the best log, the ones that would get the most money for. Maybe they'd look for a face in the bark or something. And I think that's what I'm always trying to do. Whatever you're doing, story helps you to find the fun. That's right. In the toughest parts. Yes. And I think that's one of the big values of it.
Absolutely, it's having that fun woven through storytelling. Fantastic. Which brings us on to your fantastic book, The Can Caravan, Richard, illustrated by Cindy Kong. Fantastic. So, do you just want to share with the children about this amazing book?
Of course. So, like every great book, it starts with a little story, doesn't it? And I was driving down the motorway, and this big truck was in front of me, and it had this gigantic, almost like a kind of chocolate bar shape, but it's like 40 foot long and about 10 foot tall. And it was this ingot of aluminium, and on the back it said, "This has been made from so many million drinks cans." And I thought, wow, because there's a big metal reprocessing plant about 10 miles up the road, then it would go to a factory. And I think when you work with children and when you are a storyteller, I think you don't lose that childlike quality of oh, I want to know a bit more about that. I wonder about that. So anyway, I look at this and I think, oh, I must look into that. How does the factory do them? What do they do? So on and so on. And I did all of that. And I thought, actually, when I look at a drinks can, it's kind of like the shape of the old caravans. What we would call the bow-top caravan. And I thought, I wonder. And I thought, yes, that's what I'll do. That's where the Can Caravan came from. And also about this idea of community. Because, you know, I also have experience of working in the building trade for many years. And when you're building something or you're fixing an old property, turning it into a better one or whatever, you have to work as a team. So the electrician's going to do their bit. The plumber's going to do their bit. The plasterer's going to do their bit. The bricklayer's going to do their bit. You're going to fix this timber here. You're going to do the carpentry.
Community.
You have to work as a team. And the lovely thing is, when you're working with these people you might not have met before, you work in that same place for a couple of 3 weeks, you become good friends.
Yes.
Because it's a tough environment and it's noisy, but then you have your lunch together. And then the stories come out, the building trade stories come out. And that is the start of that book, really. And I wanted to try and encapsulate that in the book.
Exactly. And I think one of the interviews we've had also too on My Words, My Book is Lanisha Butterfield, and she's written a beautiful book called The Tower Block. Yes. And her book is about a council estate, tower block, working class community. So why I love this book, The Can Caravan, Lanisha's book, is it's celebrating that not every single child lives in a house. Yes. Some children live in flats, hotels, not by choice living in a hotel. And we have to celebrate the differences and the similarities, and children looking at this Can Caravan, well, a child lives in this. And I think coming back to your point, it's celebrating community, this book. It's celebrating problem solving.
Yeah, and again, I mean, the crux of the story is, and this is how we have to be really, really careful, I think, sometimes in terms of charity, and who receives it and why they receive it, and people's pride. You know, there's an older lady who lives on this caravan site and she doesn't want charity. She's been very independent, but things have changed in her life. The people on the site are quite happy to contribute to get a new caravan, but she wouldn't like that. And I think we have to understand that with people sometimes. And that's where the girl comes in. And, you know, you meet so many clever children on your travels who are very well organized. And I also do some woodworking in school with children with this thing called lumberjunkers, where we take, you know, thrown away bits of wood and we create something. And there is this intrinsic desire to build amongst our children too. And the payoff is when you built something and somebody looks at it and goes, oh, that's amazing. There's like a sense of pride. And for some children, they haven't maybe had that sense of pride for quite a while.
Exactly. And I think coming back to your point there with the elderly lady on the caravan site, it's important always to ask and just to maybe say, how does this feel for you?
Yes.
In terms of being respectful to others by asking, because sometimes we make assumptions which may not be the right assumption.
Yes.
And I think that's super important as
Yes.
well for children to have that understanding about
Definitely.
why it is important to ask about somebody's feelings. How does this make you feel if we do this for you? And getting their opinion rather than making those assumptions, and things could go terribly wrong as a result of that, you know?
And I think every community, working class communities all the way through, have had community stuff done to them by other people. And nobody wants that. You know, so it is about asking, it is about making sure that people are comfortable with what you're doing. Exactly. And I think it goes back to storytelling as well, because we have people who will come on stage with a microphone and there's a massive, wow, fantastic, wow, look at that, big round of applause, run off, wow, didn't I do some great storytelling at them? And for me, it's about whether you're doing storytelling with people.
Exactly.
Rather than to them.
Exactly.
Or at them.
Yes, yeah. And building relationships.
Absolutely.
Which I think is
Yes.
super
Yes.
important, Richard. So that said, I think every single page in here is amazing. But what is your personal favourite page of the Can Caravan?
Well, I think, you know, we've always got to, and you read her name out before, Cindy Kang. I think we've always got to really talk about how brilliant our illustrators are.
Absolutely. High five.
Because, I mean, I am a stick person drawer, a doodler, and I do these drawings, and these people, these illustrators, just make magic from them. And I just constantly amazed, you know, I'm thinking, wow. And then sometimes they will put something in there that you didn't even think about. And that's just wonderful. So illustrators are just some of the best people on the planet. Absolutely. Getting back to my favourite page, well, there's one that's the children always notice. And there's the first page that you come to where it's got Grandad and the girl on it. Then a lot of children, especially if I'm wearing a blue shirt, they will say, is that you? Now, I certainly wasn't my intention to say, oh, I need to be in the book. But it's interesting how people, because I'm a granddad, I've got grey hair. I don't have a beard, but I have grey hair. And well, that's what the children think, and they go, Mr. O'Neill, is that you? And I go, well, not really, but I think maybe the illustrator might have looked at me and got a bit of inspiration. But my favourite page is the page where everybody's working together. And what's really lovely about it, I think, is that the child in the book, Janie, she's actually organising it all. And I think sometimes we forget just how clever children are. And I see this in school sometimes when we do projects and an 8 or 9-year-old will take over and start organising. And I just think, wow, that's wonderful. That's my favourite page in the book, where everybody's working together. And also they can see how this thing is taking shape.
Absolutely. And I think for me, coming back to that point where you said all the children get together and they collaborate, they problem solve. And my point that I always share is my son is autistic. And every time I go into a school or a festival, I'm at a museum doing a storytelling session, I always say that every single child, I'm looking into the camera, every single child has a special gift or talent. And that comes across quite nicely when we allow children to problem solve, like the example that you just gave, Richard.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is as well, you know, we going back to what we were saying before, some things are very prescriptive. And when you say autism, you know, and I've got two grandchildren who are on the spectrum, and they're very different. And there's a saying that a social worker said to me. They said, well, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And I think we, as storytellers, as authors, we're always thinking of trying to include everyone if we can.
Absolutely, absolutely. So everybody can be seen.
Yes.
Everybody can see and have that, the positive impact that has on individual self-esteem and their self-worth. But if you was interviewing you, Richard, what question would you ask yourself about this book?
Oh, that's a really good question. If I was asking myself, I've got too much knowledge of it, haven't I? If I was asking myself, I would probably say, do you think you'll be able to write it quicker next time?
Okay. And why is that? That's interesting.
Because it takes forever.
I know.
Which is a good thing. And as somebody with ADHD, I want to get things done and move on to something else. But again, I think working with other people in a collaboration, when you're creating a picture book, you're working with a whole team. So we said about illustrators, but we've got editors, which are just fantastic. We've got people doing the art to make sure the pages fit in the right place. And that is a really wonderful experience. So I think if I would probably ask myself that question, say, why can't you write it quicker? And I say, Richard, because things take the time they take. And you benefited from that experience, didn't you?
Absolutely. And it can take, sometimes children, 2 years from start to finish, from the little seed of the idea that you have to getting the book out into the shop. It can sometimes 18 months to 2 years. So it's a very long process with all of these fantastic colleagues helping. And that comes back to my point that everybody has a skill and a talent. So as an extension to that question, Richard, what do you want children to learn from the Can Caravan? What do you want their takeaways to be?
I would first of all just like them to enjoy it.
Yes.
Because I think when you read a book and you enjoy it, it will make you think about it afterwards. It'll resonate in some way. But I think also it'll make you think about picking up another book.
Yes.
And I think that's what we want our children to be, lifelong readers.
Yes.
We want them to understand that the benefits they get from that reading, they might not know about it initially, but they will down the line. So I think that's, you know, if they also take away from that, that children can do amazing things when they work together. You know, I'm a big fan of not only the editors and everybody involved in a picture book, but also teachers. You know, they get very much maligned, teachers, and teachers are amazing. And the things they do, and that's why I wanted the teachers to be in that book, because so many times I work with teachers and they'll say something like, oh, you came in to do a story in the morning. I meet them at lunchtime in a school and they go, do you know what? Because we did that, everybody's so excited about the children, we just shelved what we were going to do. And we're doing that. And I think that's just a brilliant teacher.
Absolutely. And teachers are doing so much amazing work when I go into schools. And I was at the Horniman's Museum and teachers are bringing their children to my sessions and they come up to me. And sometimes I can guess that they're a teacher. I say, you're a teacher. And they said, how did you guess? I said, by the questions you asked me and the way that you was talking to your child. I can see it. But yes, I think we do need to celebrate teachers, and equally to parents as well, because there are many children who have been homeschooled, and throwing in their staff who work in hospitals, because I go into hospitals where children have been hospitalised for many different reasons they've been hospitalised for. That is an excellent point to finish on, Richard. So thank you so much. So children, you can read the Can Caravan. And remember, as I always say in all of these interviews, to use your local library if you can use your local library. And to finish off, as Claudia and Tess say on Strictly Come Dancing, they say, keep dancing. I always say, keep reading. Thank you, Richard.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
This podcast was woven in partnership with our friends at Tapestry, the childhood education platform. They have kindly devised the educational resources for each podcast interview. Tapestry helps you celebrate children's learning, improve communication with families, and streamline your admin with powerful booking, invoicing, and management tools, giving you more time for what matters, the children and you. Visit tapestry.info to find out more. This podcast series was recorded at the Quick Brown Fox Video Production Studios in Wandsworth Town, London, with top-notch equipment and a knowledgeable team who are always happy to help. Recording our podcast has been a breeze.